All right, guys, I'm going to try this one more time. This is my fourth time trying to get this stream up and running, and I keep having issues with doing so. Um, Again, this story is about 20-year-old Porter Burks from Detroit, Michigan, who was shot and killed by D.P.D on last Sunday. As I stated earlier, the interesting thing about Mr. Burks's case is that he, like many others, suffered from a mental health issue, a mental health disease, a diagnosis of schizophrenia. Okay. On Sunday, it was evident to family members that Porter was having an episode. So they did what they knew to do. The only thing they knew to do at the time was get law enforcement involved. They did it in hopes of getting Porter help, but in return, 20-year-old Porter Burks was shot over 15 times by five Detroit, Michigan police officers. Okay. Um, it was the firing squad, as it was stated in a press conference held by Geoffrey Fieger on yesterday. What's very interesting about this case to me and why I am presenting it to the community is because the family hired Geoffrey Fieger to represent them. Geoffrey Fieger eloquently speaks about the issues that our nation faces as it relates to the breakdown in the mental health systems across this nation. I want you guys to pay attention to the way he attacks this case because I have a good feeling from this point on that Geoffrey Fieger is going to be the new advocate, so to speak, for people who are diagnosed with mental health, either diseases or disorders. So let me go ahead on and try to get this up and running for you guys once again. Guys, please wish me luck. I'm not good with all of this technology, but I'm giving it one more try. Okay, so I need to share my screen with you all. Go to my Chrome tabs. I'm sharing Facebook here. Okay. So I'm going to begin to let you listen to what Geoffrey Fieger has to say um, on this issue. And throughout the press conference, you are going to hear Geoffrey Fieger not shy away from very important questions that needs to be answered by the chief of police. And he goes directly at him, shooting these questions to him, wanting specific answers. He wants to know why these things are happening. And yes, Jeffrey goes right in and he goes straight for the jugular, focusing on the chief of police who put out a video that we all know was extremely edited, and it was edited to the point to where we can call it fraudulent. And I'll get to that later. But let's go ahead and take a listen.
Kiana Wilson, who is Porter Burks' mom, and she is going to be the personal representative of the estate uh, in terms of the lawsuit that is going to be filed against the Detroit police officers and the Detroit Police Department as a result of the killing of Porter Burks last Sunday. Um, However, that lawsuit cannot be filed until Kiana is appointed by the probate court. We expect that the probate court will appoint her today. We filed all the necessary documents, and it's just going through the normal processes. Um, and so Kiana will be appointed. Um, the rest of the folks here are family members of Porter. I thought it was important that they be here because we have what I consider to be an intolerable situation that occurred in the city of Detroit, in which a clearly mentally ill young man was executed by a Detroit Police Department firing squad of 5 officers firing reportedly 38 times towards or into his body. I believe he was hit in excess of 15 times, but we are having an autopsy conducted today by Dr. Werner Spitz, and we will have more information concerning the exact number of rounds that entered Porter's body as a result of this execution. I want to start by saying to anybody who's listening, and I hope that Chief White is listening too, that I have more questions today than I have answers, since this only occurred less than 4 full days ago, or about 4 days ago. All the answers that I'm going to obtain during this investigation process that I go through when I file a lawsuit, all the answers are not present. However, I do have many questions. I would like to say, although I disagree with many of the things Chief White said, I do agree with him in one particular area. And I think that he is correct. And I think that he tried to communicate to you and the public and the people of the city of Detroit an essential problem that occurs in this state and many other states. I ran for governor slightly more than 20 years ago. My opponent at that time had been serving as governor, and he was in office for 12 years. And he touted the fact that he had closed virtually all the mental health facilities in the state of Michigan. The state of Michigan at that time defunded mental health. There was an absurd belief that you could medicate mentally ill people like Porter, close down the mental health facilities, put the onus on local hospitals and emergency rooms. But what in fact happened is that instead of mental health then being a health issue taken care of by doctors and trained professionals, nurses, psychologists, social workers, instead it has been defaulted to the police and the prisons. And we now house mentally ill people instead of in hospitals, in prisons, and we expect that police and prison officials should appropriately deal with mental health. They're not trained to do so. They're not capable of doing so. And notwithstanding Chief's statements about these highly trained police officers, I've watched the video numerous times and doing what he was trained to do. If the training consists of executing clearly mentally ill young men or women, that training is grossly inadequate, deficient, and nonsensical. So I do agree that it is a crisis. I agree, and I call on all the officials who can hear my words that the defunding of the mental health facilities in Michigan has to stop. And the requirement that police and prison officials are somehow now in charge of the mentally ill is patently absurd and has to change and results in hundreds, if not more, deaths. And it certainly is the resulted in Porter Burks' death. Having said that, I totally am at odds with Chief White in terms of his press conference and his statements to the public concerning his descriptions of what happened. First, let me describe, I think, some of the background that the press conference that was conducted by the authorities, the purpose was to provide some propaganda, some cover for what really happened. For instance, there was a gentleman who described previous incidents with Porter Burks involving his family, claiming that he had stabbed his family members. Porter Burks has never been arrested nor charged with any crime. Porter Burks was never seriously injured any of his family members. Did several of his siblings get cut? Yes, but there was a recognition that he was mentally ill and that this was not a intentional or dangerous occurrence, but rather a mental health, a psychotic break. Porter suffered from a disease that's considered familial in nature. In other words, it is understood to be passed down and to exist in families. The disease is known as paranoid schizophrenia. It is a disease of the brain. It affects the dopamine receptors of the brain. It prevents people from thinking and acting rationally in its more extreme senses. It causes people to hallucinate. It causes people to hear voices. And it is a real disease. It is as real as heart disease. It is as real as cancer. It is as real as any other physical disease, and it should be treated as such. The idea that we should treat mental illness with the police and guns is medieval. That's what they used to do in medieval times, chain people up to walls in insane asylums. Well, we have now graduated to executing them with firing squads. He suffered from a real disease which they knew about. That disease often is familial, and indeed there's several family members who suffered from that disease. I believe a grandmother. It often manifests at puberty. Puberty stimulates in some way that disease, and so it is very common for that disease to manifest itself at the beginning of puberty. And in fact, it did manifest itself in Porter Burks when he was 17 years old and going through puberty. Prior to that time, he had had no problems, and he did not and had not operated under a diagnosis. So he had suffered from the disease for about 3 years. Because we don't treat mental illness in this state like we should, we simply keep people like Porter on the margins of society. We provide them with medication. He was taking medication once a month. You used to have to take the pills every day. And the medications are not wonder drugs, but they tend to damper the hallucinations and the paranoid ideations. He was on that, but periodically those medications don't work. And patients who suffer from this disease suffer psychotic breaks. And that's exactly what happened to Porter. He was suffering from a medical psychotic break, just like if somebody was suffering from a heart attack, you wouldn't shoot a man or woman suffering from a heart attack or in extreme pain from cancer. You don't shoot people who are suffering psychotic breaks from schizophrenia. Now, Chief White then put on what I think was a propaganda show, suggesting, for instance, that the knife that Porter was carrying was not a pocket knife, which is nonsense. It's a foldable knife. The blade is, I believe, 3.5 inches. The total length when opened, Chief White represented as 8 inches, but the blade isn't 8 inches. And this entire regrettable and preventable incident occurred, I guess, beginning about 4 in the morning on Sunday. Porter's brother, DeMarco, called the police. You saw the video, and reported that his brother, who is mentally ill, who suffers from schizophrenia, had a pocket knife, wouldn't give it to the family, and he was alerting the police because that's the only thing you can do in this state. Call the police because they're the people who have to take care of mentally ill people. He reported truthfully things about his brother that should have alerted the police to treat him in an entirely different manner. Now, Chief White, I have real problems with your next descriptions and your, I guess, the video show that you played the public. I do not have the videos. My understanding is obviously that there is more than one video because you played at least two during your press conference in which you began from one officer's body cam showing the confrontation and showing the discussion between Porter and that officer, that unidentified officer, and then you switched to another body cam for no apparent reason whatsoever, and then turned off the video. So we, as far as I know, nobody's seen the entire videos. Now, I have to believe, since there were 5 police officers there are 5 body cams. I also have to believe that there are neighbors in the area directly next to what transpired here, who have had their Ring cameras confiscated by the Detroit police. And so I would like Chief White to turn over all of those videos. Contrary to Chief White's assertion, or at least suggesting that this took place or he was shot within 6 feet or 3 feet, that's preposterous. As you can see by the videos, Porter was a tremendous distance away from the police officers when he was executed. Our calculations indicate that it may be as far as 46 feet when they began shooting him. Now, of course, I don't have the remainder of the videos, so I don't know at the point at which they began executing him by firing squad whether they ran up towards him. However, I do have the videos, and the videos also display something else that the chief didn't talk about. The chief claims that Porter was tased prior to being shot. That would be consistent with what we see on the video. My understanding is that certain tasers can shoot up to 35 feet or more. If that's true, what I believe may be displayed on the video, and I would expect all of you can go back into your newsrooms and start playing it, is that when Porter lifts up his arms and begins almost it appears, just as he's being shot, a frantic dance, that he's being tased. So he's being electrocuted, he's being electrified, he's being lit up by police. And then the excuse to shoot him 38 times is that he was approaching the police, which was absurd. He was lifting up his arms and he was then executed with 38 shots. We'll have to take a look at the rest of the video before we can confirm everything that actually happened, and in fact, whether in fact he was tased, although my understanding is from Chief White that he was. Now, Chief White, please explain to me why, when you've got a young 20-year-old mentally ill young man who's saying, I believe on the video, I just want to go home and rest, why you can't figure out a better way to deal with him than executing him by firing squad. I'm a lawyer. I'm not a police professional. I don't claim to be. But if Porter Burks was an animal, a vicious animal, a tiger, a lion, you know how to shoot him with tranquilizing gun. Why would you shoot him with 38 bullets? Why would you treat him worse than a wild animal? Why would you do that? You have all sorts of equipment. You said you turned off all the vehicles. If you were afraid of a 3-inch knife, roll up the windows to your vehicle and drive up to him. Bring one of those armored vehicles that you use for bomb disposal. They can't be hurt by a 3-inch knife. How about all that body armor? All that body armor that police have. They have helmets, they have arm and chest armor, they have bulletproof vests everywhere. Are you telling me that today you don't have sufficient equipment to send an officer towards somebody with a 3-inch knife, and instead you have to execute him beginning at 45 feet? That's patently absurd. And if anybody believes that it's reasonable to shoot under these circumstances 5 officers 38 times when there are a myriad of alternatives that could have been used to peacefully end this situation, then I have trouble understanding that logic. That's what we've devolved into, that it's acceptable to execute mentally ill people. Chief, you didn't go on and say that you dumped Porter's body at the Sinai Grace Hospital. You shot him dead 38 times or less if all your officers' guns didn't hit their intended target. And then you handcuffed him. Tell me about that. Tell me about that, Chief. Tell me about who handcuffed a dead body, shot 38 times. And tell me who took Porter to the Sinai Grace Hospital and dumped him off there and didn't tell the medical doctors at Sinai Grace what had happened to Porter. Just left him there with his father and other family members. The doctors had no idea what had happened to Porter. They didn't know who had shot him. Nobody told them. Explain that, Chief. I think there's a lot of other things that need explaining in this case. That's why I have more questions than I do answers. But again, this is the inevitable result of the defunding of mental health in this state. the turning over of authority over mentally ill people to the police and the prisons, a police force that is, and I'm not saying that the chief people acted much differently than any other police force, because they are totally inadequately trained to deal with mentally ill people. This should never, ever have happened. The law looks at these things and says, what could we do? Well, some of the reasons for hiring me is to effect changes, not just to get money from a police department of the state of Michigan, although you defunded the police, now you've got to pay, or you defunded the mental health authorities, now you've got to pay for what the police have done. But the reason for hiring me and to bring a lawsuit is to effectuate change, to make things different so this doesn't happen again. This shouldn't happen again. And to make sure that the truth comes out, to make sure that this isn't glossed over, to make sure that there are answers. Because out of this tragedy can come change, and can come a realization. Maybe in this society we're unable to do that, but we could hope for better. And that's why this lawsuit is taking place. So if there's any cynical people out there who say this family hired Jeff Fieger for money, that's total and complete nonsense. Although that's all I can sue for, money, damages, because that's the way our legal system works. I want answers. I want answers in this case. I'm not in it. And this family isn't in it for money. They can't bring him back. They want answers. And there's thousands, hundreds of thousands of other porters out there who this shouldn't happen to ever. And if what we do in this case can end the possibility that others will be executed like him, that'll be sufficient for me. So, in conclusion, I hope to bring the lawsuit next week. Kiana will be appointed the personal representative. We will file a lawsuit alleging negligence against the police officers, violations of the state Civil Rights Act, violations of the state constitution, and we may also bring a federal civil rights complaint. I haven't decided whether I'll do that, and I'll be glad to answer any questions you have.
Jeff, two questions for me. Why does the mother need to be appointed a personal representative that you automatically call?
No. The law of the state of Michigan, under what we call the Wrongful Death Act, requires that a family member or a designated person be appointed before you can bring a lawsuit. In a personal injury action where the person is still alive, you're allowed to bring the action immediately. If a person has died, only one person can bring a lawsuit. The probate court must appoint the personal representative, and once the personal representative is appointed, the lawsuit can be filed. Until and unless a personal representative is appointed by the probate court, it can't be filed. And so that constrains us legally from filing it today. However, the papers have been filed. Things go a little slower today in courts just because of we're getting back up to speed from COVID. It usually doesn't take as long as it takes nowadays, but it will be done within the next day.
And my second question, according to the police, Mr. Burks had been committed to Sinai Grace Medical Board and escaped. There was a allegedly violent encounter in the 6 Mile Road. He then went back in and was somehow released. Is there any thought to put him in hospital?
No, and he's not. To describe it in those terms is nonsense. He's being treated. He's not in jail at Sinai Hospital. He didn't escape. He's being treated. People like him who suffer from severe mental illness don't have cognition in the manner in which people understand cognition. Many times they don't understand right from wrong. The paranoid delusions, the voices, the hallucinations overwhelm them. So their activities can't be described as escaping. They can't be described as some kind of prisoner who's doing things volitionally. These are sick people. So when you start describing what Chief White did in the terms that how he did, in the terms that he did, for instance, I heard those words too, that he escaped, also that he assaulted, that he stabbed uh, siblings. All of that was meant to prejudice the public's view of what occurred here. Because as a member of the public, Chief, I sat there watching and I saw the incredible distance between the officer whose body cam was filming this and Porter, and I saw him being shot at a distance that no one in their right mind would think that they're in danger. And that was unexplainable to me. It's unacceptable. It's grossly negligent. It's excessive force. And it needs to stop and it needs to be explained. And you clearly, Chief, understood that there was a problem. You clearly knew that something was out of sorts here because you called that press conference and you edited that video in a manner in which, and you conducted that in a manner in which, that frankly, while I do agree with you about the mental health crisis, and I think that you're probably a very kind and sensitive man, there was an intentional decision in that press conference to mislead the public about what occurred in this case. And that is why we're doing this. We have to get the answers. No, of course he doesn't get follow-up care. I've just explained to you. The state of Michigan doesn't provide that. And unless you're a very, very wealthy person and your family provides for it, and even then it's difficult because the resources aren't there. The resources aren't there. Sinai Grace Hospital isn't responsible. They're not a prison over there. They're doing the best that they can, and they are not set up as a state psychiatric facility. By all rights, Porter needed to be hospitalized in state psychiatric hospitals that no longer exist. I have to explain to you, except for people who are sentenced by the courts and found not guilty by virtue of criminal insanity, in which they're basically imprisoned in what we call some mental hospitals, but they're really not. They're really prisons. There are no hospitals for mentally ill people in this state. We closed them all down. And to expect Sinai Grace or any other hospital to be able to adequately deal with the mental health crisis in this country, including treating paranoid schizophrenia, is insane. I mean, that's truly insane to suggest that they're set up without any funds, without any ability to take care of the number of people that they would have to take care, and it's their responsibility. That's nonsense. But I do agree with him. We are in a crisis. And what's happened is that this entire incident defaulted to them. And all they have guns. And apparently, I'm not going to, Chief, if you think that was appropriate, if you think that executing a child, mentally ill child, from the distance at which that video shows, by 38 shots and 5 officers, if you think that's appropriate activity, then you and I don't see eye to eye on that. And I don't think reasonable people would agree with you that that's a reasonable way to deal with mental illness and a reasonable way to have dealt with Porter Burks. And that's why we're going to go through this litigation and get some answers. But I do agree with you. You are woefully, the police department is woefully inadequate to deal with mental illness, woefully inadequate to deal with the type of crisis that he was going through. And to put it on your backs, I agree, is unfair because you're not trained to deal with it. Your officers don't know how to deal with it. Your officers have guns and they kill people. But Other than that, they didn't do a very good job at addressing the situation. I wish I had more answers, except that it's been reported to me by Porter's dad that he was transported there and dropped off. His dad was at the hospital waiting. Kiana could not get there in time. She arrived later, but she's confirmed what I'm telling you now. He was handcuffed, which is, I mean, that sounds medieval to me. He was dropped off by what the dad described as an assistant police officer, but certainly not nobody with authority, and that the doctors were not informed as to what had happened to Porter, had no idea at what had happened to him. So if I use the word dumped, I think that would be appropriate, that his body was dumped at the entry to the emergency room at Sinai Grace without any disclosure as to what had happened to him, in handcuffs. Now, why you handcuff somebody who's been shot that many times, I'm not sure. Is that following procedures too? That's just, Chief, that's just kind of common, just ordinary, regular procedure. We handcuff bodies. They knew he was shot. They didn't know by who. He didn't know if he had been shot by a burglar. They had no idea what had happened to him. The police didn't come there and explain this. And by the way, the family wasn't invited to the chief's press conference. Several family members showed up because he advertised it. But Chief, you didn't invite the family. I only been told what Chief White said. It's woefully inadequate and incompetent if their crisis intervention team consists of somebody holding out their hand 30, 40, 50 feet away. And if somebody raises their hands like Porter Burks did in that video, he has a firing squad behind him and they shoot him 38 times after tasing him. If that's crisis intervention, God help us all. I've said it repeatedly, that those attempts to talk about his prior hospitalizations, which are true, he's been hospitalized, he's had severe illness for 3 years. Those facts are true. But what does that have to do with what happened here? He went through a long litany of prior incidents that they claim occurred. They grossly exaggerated them. But I'd like to know, since nobody at that location in Detroit at approximately 6 a.m. last Sunday knew anything about Porter except that he was mentally ill, what did that have to do? They spent most of the press conference, Chief, talking about that. What did that have to do with shooting him 38 times? Not one of those officers who shot him knew anything about him other than he was mentally ill. Not one thing. So what did that have to do? How did that justify, Chief, shooting him 38 times from that distance? And why did you tell people the last shot, I think he said, what was it, Todd? He said the last shot was 3 or 6 feet? Yeah, 6 feet. When was the first shot, Chief? Was the first shot from 48 feet and the last shot was the coup de grace from 6 feet? What was it, Chief? Those are the questions that I have, and there will be answers. Well, listen, let me make it clear. There's many causes of action that I can bring. Over my career, this spans nearly 50 years now. You can bring cases in state court, you can bring cases in federal court. Those are tactical decisions. Many of the state court claims are very similar to the federal court claims. So the decision I make is really what court I want to be in. And if I make a decision, for instance, that I want to be in Wayne County court, then I bring state cases, counts. If I make a decision I want to be in federal court, I bring federal counts. But in these type of cases, the federal causes of action and the state causes of action are so similar that it really, for my purposes, I decide where I want to bring the case in terms of what court, because the laws are so similar.
What do you say to those who have loved ones who may be going through a catheter or something like that? Should they be hesitant to pick up the phone and dial 911?
100%. Here's what I say, and that's a great question. For the thousands of Michigan residents who have children or loved ones in identical situations as Porter, think 50 times before you call the police, because the police shoot ill people. They shoot paranoid schizophrenics as an excuse. They do not treat them. The police are about the last people you want to involve, although you would hope you could involve the police. Under the circumstances that exist in this state, the police think that they can kill people like Porter with impunity and get away with it because he, quote unquote, threatened them. Well, I don't think it. I think that that claim is idle in these circumstances. I think it's provably idle. I think it's, by the video, nonsense. And my experience tells me that this happens far too often, in which police become involved in situations that really require mental health facilities and mental health professionals, and instead the police end up shooting ill people, which is utter and complete nonsense. One more question. Long-term help doesn't exist in the state, period. People don't understand. There's no such thing as mental hospitals in this state. If you think you can get long-term care for a mentally ill individual in the state of Michigan, you are whistling Dixie. It doesn't exist. All you can get is single type care for incidents, and then you'll be lucky if you can get that. That is why I started this conference in saying I do agree with Chief White. There is a mental health crisis. It began about 25, 30 years ago when the state of Michigan closed all the mental health facilities and touted it and said we were going to just pass out medications to paranoid schizophrenics and we'll get them off the street and we'll, in effect, leave this to the police and the prisons. And that is what happens in this state. The only long-term care that mentally ill people get is prison. That's the long-term care we offer in this state. And that's got to change. And Chief White told you that also. It's true. It's true. Okay, thank you very much.
There you have it, guys. These are the words of Geoffrey Fieger and how he feels about what's happening with the mental health situation in the state of Michigan. Um, he so passionately spoke about this issue that for some reason I feel like he may have taken this case because it feels like it's personal, guys. And I have a feeling that we will be seeing more from Geoffrey Fieger speaking out on mental health issues and on this case. Thank you guys for lending me your time on this afternoon. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day. And I'll be coming back a little later to share more information about this case with you all. Again, thank you for your time. Have a blessed evening. Bye bye.